Today's episode is brought to you by Positively Productive Systems, whose mission is to be the antidote to your stress and to provide compassionate productivity resources and coaching that help you heal and achieve. Be sure to check out both free and paid resources at positivelyproductive.com/resources.
I think guilt comes from a lot of different places. Productivity is certainly one of them. There's just too much to do and not enough time to do it in. And the expectations we place on ourselves are often unrealistic. So it leads to guilt when at the end of the day, I always talk about the difference between what we can do and what we plan to do. So we think that just because we can fit in 15 things in our day, we should be able to. What I talk to parents about is just plan what you want to do and feel good. So we often, though, feel guilty when we don't do what we can do. And then the other piece I see a lot of is obviously the parenting guilt. It's I know my kids need this, or I don't even know what my kids need. All I know is I'm seeing lots of negative behavior, lots of negative moods. And so there's this guilt that I should know this as a parent. So I feel like there's the productivity guilt, the overwhelm guilt, and then the parenting guilt as well.
You're listening to the Positively Living podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Zawrotny, founder of Positively Productive Systems and a coach certified in time and stress management, helping clients make space for what matters most in their lives. Join me each episode and we'll talk about decluttering, stress management, habits, personalized productivity, gratitude, and so much more. I understand the overwhelm of life because I'm a wife, mom to kids and cats, and a former caregiver. I'm here to help you choose what's right for you so you can do less, live more, and breathe easier. Sound good? Let's get to it. If I say I struggle with mom guilt, would you know what I mean? And would you tell me you are too? If you're dealing with it, know that you aren't alone. You are in good company with so much empathy from me and from all the other moms who are trying to move on from it. The concept is so prevalent and, if I'm being honest, and you know I always am with you, completely unfair. We are all doing our very best here, and I truly believe guilt doesn't serve us. In today's episode, my guest confirms that and helps us go deeper to why we're struggling as parents, how we can help ourselves and our children cope better, and how we can move on from the unnecessary guilt and shame that keeps us stuck and stressed. Today, I welcome Rachel Bailey to the Positively Living podcast. Rachel is a parenting specialist who has been serving families for over a decade. Besides being a mother of two, she also has a master's degree in clinical psychology, a certification in positive discipline, and has provided services as an ADHD coach, in-home mentor, and therapist. Currently, Rachel teaches parents hands-on tools for raising responsible, resilient, confident children, and helping parents find the time and energy to incorporate those tools into their lives. You can hear her advice on her podcast, Your Parenting Long Game, which I highly recommend. In today's conversation, we cover a variety of parenting struggles and perspectives, including how guilt and shame trap us and keep us from taking action, and how imperative it is to shift our expectations as parents, especially during challenging times like a pandemic. Rachel shares her extensive knowledge about children's behavior, including ADHD and the executive function of the brain, and it's an eye-opener. It reinforces the conversation I had with Tiffany Blassingame in episode 36 about organizing for students. The key takeaway of my conversation with Rachel is that as parents, we must start with our struggles first. When we do that, we are much better able to be the parents we want to be. Welcome, Rachel Bailey, to the Positively Living podcast. I am so delighted to have you here and talk about a pressing issue for all moms that doesn't seem to go away. And I'm really looking forward to getting into it with you today. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Would you start by telling us a bit about who you are, who you help, and really what makes you light up?
Sure. So I am, most importantly to me anyway, at this point in my life, I'm a mom. I have two daughters who are 8 and just 11. This is actually my daughter's 11th birthday today. And in addition to being a mom, I'm also a wife, and I love I love lettering. I love listening to music. I love watching movies that make me cry. So those are all the things that kind of fuel me. But then professionally, my background is in clinical psychology, and I support parents for a living, improving the behavior, moods, and attitudes in the home of both the children and the parents.
Love that. There was something that you had said when we chatted one time, and I think it was about how we look as parents to figure out what to do with our kids and how to guide them. And really, it's about guiding the parents and it's about guiding ourselves, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because I actually teach a lot of parenting tools and strategies. How do you get your kids off screens? How do you deal with them not cleaning? But you can't actually implement any of those tools if you're not in a good place yourself as a parent. So it is about the parenting tools that I teach, but it's also about how do we get ourselves as parents, as humans, to a place where we can implement the tools and not feel guilty because we're drained and don't have the time or energy to do what our kids need us to do.
Exactly. I love the parallel here with how I coach productivity. And there are so many productivity tools out there, right? I mean, it's a list a mile long. We are not lacking in options for how we can be more productive. But what we need to know is what works best for us, what's really going to resonate and how we're going to show up best with that. And that's what you do from the parenting side, right?
That's exactly right. That's why we get along so well.
Yay. I love that. Okay. So let's start with the reasons that you see the guilt that's happening. We talk about mom guilt. I mean, we can also talk about dads too. I'm sure you see both sides of it. What are those challenges or that sort of, I don't even know if I want to call it an imbalance, but the struggles, I guess, if you will, that you're seeing with parents?
Yeah. And I think guilt comes from a lot of different places. Productivity is certainly one of them. There's just too much to do and not enough time to do it in. And the expectations we place on ourselves are often unrealistic. So it leads to guilt when at the end of the day, I always talk about, and I'm sure this overlaps a lot with what you're talking about, but I talk about the difference between doing what we can do and what we plan to do. So we think that just because we can fit in 15 things in our day, we should be able to. What I talk to parents about is just plan what you want to do and feel good and plan 3 things. And if you've got those 3 things done, then feel good about it. So we often, though, feel guilty when we don't do what we can do. We don't think about the fact that we're humans who need sleep and who need to rejuvenate and energize ourselves. We just feel guilty because we're not robots and we can't, if they're 24 hours in a day, we should be able to fill it all and do it. We can't, and we feel guilty. And then the other piece I see a lot of is obviously the parenting guilt. It's I know my kids need this, or I don't even know what my kids need. All I know is I'm seeing lots of negative behavior, lots of negative moods. And so there's this guilt that I should know this as a parent, or I don't, or I know it and I can't do it because I'm tired or because I get too triggered by my kids. So I feel like there's the productivity guilt, the overwhelm guilt, and then the parenting guilt as well.
Yeah, that's described so well because in there, it makes me think of our feelings. And of course, coming as a parent myself, I know that this is a thing of that feeling, the not enoughness. I talk about all the time for guilt across the board is when we somehow feel like we're not doing enough. We're not enough for what it is that we don't even know what our children need, but yet somehow we're feeling guilty because somehow we're confident that we're not giving them enough.
I love that you bring that up because that's one of the reasons I actually got into working with parents to begin with. I was actually a therapist for mostly teenagers. And what I was realizing is that I could help the teens, but if I actually worked with parents to stop sending this message to your kids to begin with, all these teens that I saw were anxious and self-harm and, depression. And I was like, oh my gosh, if I could actually start working with parents. So I made the shift about 11 years ago now, but at that time I was like, I need to tell parents to stop sending these messages to their kids that they're not good enough because we're all growing up into adults believing we're not good enough. And that's why I shifted to working with parents.
Now, for those of us who are still struggling with this, that's why I want to have this conversation so we can start looking at this differently. And the more that we can, I think, especially as a mom community or a parenting community, say, hey, we're all doing the best we can here.
Yep.
And often in impossible situations, right? Because I'm sure you've seen even more right now. You and I are recording this in the second quarter of 2021. And this past year, it's even been more than the past year now, the entire world's been dealing with a pandemic that has shifted everything about how we interact with our families.
Yep, absolutely. And what I always say too is that as the situation changed, our expectations didn't change. Our expectations of ourselves and of our children, they didn't change. They actually increased. So the
Mm.
situation shifted, but we increased the expectations on ourselves and our children. And it's like, wait, what? It doesn't even like, how could that possibly work? Then we feel guilty though when we don't meet those increased expectations during a global pandemic.
Well, that sounds like a recipe for disappointment and frustration.
Exactly. And anxiety and depression, which is what a lot of people are dealing with. Yeah, absolutely.
So we basically upped the level of difficulty
Mm-hmm.
without necessarily having the tools to handle it while we were already, struggling to begin with. And we're
Exactly
like,
right.
okay, let's make it more difficult and then expect even more out of ourselves. Thank you for that, because it's something I think we just get caught up in. It's like, okay, what's the next thing we have to do? What's the next thing we have to do? And we're focused on the doing and the steps and not actually stepping back to say, wait a minute, what makes sense here?
Yeah, exactly. And what is it that we really need? Do we really need to make sure that our kids are paying exact attention on online school? Or do we actually need to comfort them a little bit and deal with what they're going through and then maybe give them some tools to do better? I mean, it's just our priorities were not in sync with what was going on, what's been going on.
Right.
And so people are really unhappy.
One of the phrases I think that you described and when we were planning to talk about this is this idea of recognizing this guilt, understanding, seeing where it's happening, and maybe being able to mark that point where we're like, oh, wait, let me take a moment, step back. So could you walk us through that, what we need to be looking for, and then what we can do?
Guilt in itself, I love Brene Brown. And if anyone has not heard Brene Brown at this point, most people have. When I first started listening to her years and years ago, before anyone knew who she was, and they were like, wait, Brene, how do you spell that? Now everyone knows who she is. If you don't yet, it's Brene. She talks about guilt, though, clinically, as actually not an unhealthy emotion. Shame is an unhealthy emotion because shame, and there's an implication that there's nothing I can do to change. This is part of who I am. I'm a bad person. Guilt, though, is where we say, hey, I did something wrong. I need to learn from that and do something different. Guilt to me can be really healthy when we are recognizing, hey, I feel guilty that I did that. I feel guilty that I keep yelling at my kids. I need to take a step back and say, and this is one of the things I do a lot when I'm helping people with their guilt, is I say, okay, turn your judgment on yourself to curiosity. If you feel guilty that you are yelling at your kids, instead of saying, oh my gosh, I keep yelling at my kids. Why am I yelling at my kids? Say to yourself, why am I yelling at my kids? And curiosity leads to answers. So recognizing that guilt can actually be helpful. And if you get stuck, it's because you're not looking at it as guilt. You're looking at it as there's something wrong with me and I can't change it.
Oh, that's so good. Yeah, we talk a lot on the Positively Living podcast about how as soon as you get curious, that lets you release the judgment, which then is linked to shame. So I really like that. And I think that's such an important distinction, that the guilt itself can be healthy. So thank you for that, because this is a classic case of when we look at something and it's like, no, go deeper, go deeper. It's not the guilt that's the issue. It's what does the guilt do? Well, it causes shame and it gets you trapped and then it gets you stuck and you feel like there's nothing you can do about this. And then that just, that just snowballs, right? Into a really, really difficult and potentially despondent situation versus if you let go of the shame of it and you say, hey, I'm human. I didn't like that. But I also like that you're talking about guilt as, I guess, like a sign to say, ooh, if I didn't like that didn't feel right for me. I don't want to be the mom that's constantly yelling at my kids. Okay. Yeah. And you know what? Let's figure out why. And I totally know from the stress and productivity side, like why that can happen. And I pay close attention for, myself personally, like how much sleep have you had, Lisa? And, how do you show up best? And, have you eaten hangry much?
Exactly.
Right. Things like that. Okay, so I love that distinction. We have the guilt and the shame. So it's releasing the shame part of it, getting curious and saying, okay, what's going on? Then what do we do next?
That's the key. The what do we do next? What I talk about is this concept of yuck. That's what I'm kind of known for, is yuck is basically a term I use to describe anything uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. So when we're struggling in some way. And what I always say is that action reduces yuck. Action will always reduce yuck. It's when we stay stuck in our heads and we're like, I hate that I yell. I can't believe I talk to my kids like that. So for me, it's if, like you just said, if it feels wrong to you, and then you say with curiosity, okay, why am I doing this? What action can I take to do something better? And action gets us unstuck from yuck. It really does, from our struggles.
And it's the idea of, I'm trying to remember where the phrase came from. It's in my head forever. And it's like, you can't steer a parked car.
Right. That's a great metaphor for this. You can't steer a parked car. You have to start moving. And one of the things I teach my kids, they roll their eyes, but I really believe they've learned this lesson, is that everything is either a win or a learn. I didn't make that up. I've heard that from someone, but everything you do is either a win or a learn. And my kids have really internalized that as much as they roll their eyes. And so we'll say, okay, that didn't go well. What did you learn? And then you've started to steer the car. You might need to steer in another direction, but at least you've learned, you've started to take action. And it's amazing how our brain stops sensing danger when we do start to move forward. It's just the inaction that really leads to anxiety and depression, or potentially.
My children are definitely hearing this phrase today. I'm going to be sharing it with them. Everything you do is either a win or a learn. What they hear from me all the time is act like a scientist. How many scientists do you know who they don't call it failure? They just, okay.
It's information.
Yeah, it's data to collect, and okay, that didn't work. That didn't work. What's next? How do we tweak the parameters, the environment, ourselves to see what will work best? And, it's a constant course correction. So
that's exactly right.
All right. So let's talk about taking action. What we feel this yuck. I love that. The yuck. And we know something's off and we want to make changes. What do we do next?
So it depends if we're dealing with our yuck or our children's yuck. We really have to see behavior as a symptom. So if a child is, for example, and one of the things I specialize in when it comes to parenting is helping parents whose kids have big emotions, who are really dramatic and, sensitive. And if we see that a child is sensitive and they're having these really big reactions over what appears to be nothing, to me, that's a symptom. That's something that a child is in yuck. And actually, the way I describe it to parents is that means that when you see a big emotion or a big behavior, someone's yuck is bigger than their coping skills. So that's all that means. So parents come to me, my child is hitting, or my child is, just melting down all the time. To me, that's like, okay, they have more yuck than coping skills. So the action would be, we need to reduce the yuck and increase the coping skills. And that's basically what I teach for a living for both parents and children. How do we reduce our yuck and increase our coping skills? Because you can't and you shouldn't reduce yuck to zero. What I've studied in the past is resilience. That's actually one of my areas of clinical interest. And we don't want to reduce the yuck completely. You can't. We can reduce the unnecessary yuck, but we also just want to increase coping skills. So that's generally the next action I find is, how do we figure out what the yuck is and how do we increase their skills?
So that yuck that you're describing and the resilience that you're describing, would I be able to understand that in terms of stress and pressure that we have on ourselves? Would that?
Absolutely.
Right. Okay. So that idea, I think it's the Yerkes-Dodson law of this idea that you do need some stress, right? To promote that productivity and the energy that you need. But then it's a bell curve, right? So then it will eventually max out and then overwhelm. So that's what's happening. Okay.
And overwhelm is the sign right there that your coping skills aren't big enough to handle it. Most people don't have great skills. It's not even just coping skills. It's really what we call executive functioning skills. So even something as simple as my kids won't clean. I hear that all the time. I ask them to clean their room. I walk away for 5 minutes. I come back and they're playing with a toy. That's actually an executive functioning skill. To be able for a child to be able to persist in a boring task is a skill, and they don't have that skill. So again, this misbehavior of a child not cleaning is really that they are missing that coping skill or that executive functioning skill to allow them to behave better. So behavior is only a symptom that we either need to reduce the yuck or increase their skills.
So a big part of this too is managing our expectations. You
got it. Absolutely. Especially when it comes to executive functioning skills. So if we're getting more into the practical, like parenting tips now, things like kids getting off of their screens. I hear that all the time. My kids won't get off their screens. They freak out. They melt down. That's actually an executive functioning skill. And the executive functioning skills that allow us to be mature and responsible, those don't mature until we're in our mid-20s.
Right.
So even parents of like 15-year-olds are like, they're 15, they should be able to do this. No, actually, unless we give them strategies, they don't know how to do that. Now, it's not an excuse, but it is a reason. And so we have to teach our kids these tools, which then circles back to, do we have the energy to give our kids what they need to be successful? And when we pour these unrealistic expectations on ourselves, we don't have the energy, then we don't give kids what they need, then we have all this negativity, and there comes the guilt.
And the thing about like cleaning the room, I mean, that's a classic case. And of course, I've gotten that question many, many times. And especially, in the days of doing professional organizing and right, shifting from that, it's like, guess what? Hi, professional organizer here. I may have all the tools, but my children don't yet.
Mm-hmm, that's exactly right.
So it's okay. Take heart. My children don't have pristine rooms unless I go in and do that, but I don't actually see the benefit of that. I think we all have to grow into, the levels that work for us and to be able to manage that. So if they have messier rooms, I couldn't walk into my son's room today.
Yeah.
But it's okay because I also understand that he needs to grow into these skills and also into the appreciation. I mean, we all have different clutter thresholds just in this particular example.
Mm-hmm.
But speaking of the executive functioning, so thank you for that, because I think that's such an important conversation to have, how long the development takes and how we really need to step back with our expectations as to what our children are able to do. And some of them, they might surprise us early on, but I think those are probably different inclinations that they have. I mean, you have some children who are inclined to be neater and some who are inclined to be messier. And I mean, it's sort of the different idiosyncrasies and personalities, right, that you're dealing with.
And people, certain areas of our capability develop at different levels. So some kids may have really good executive functioning skills, but poor social skills.
Yeah.
And they, so that we develop differently. The other thing is, though, when you're talking about lowering expectations, absolutely, but it's also not reducing them to zero. There are strategies. So I was an ADHD coach for many years before I worked with parents. And what I used to say to kids with ADHD was, ADHD is a reason, but not an excuse. So you still do have to turn in your homework and you still do have to be able to do these things. But we have to, when we talk about expectations, we have to expect they can't do this on their own. We need to give them support and compensatory strategies and what I used to call external cues, which were reminders, because their brain doesn't intrinsically remind themselves to stay on task or to transition to something else. So it's about making expectations realistic, but also not using that as an excuse and saying we could teach you strategies.
Yes. And were you looking at my notes? Because that was going to be my next question. We were what a beautiful segue. Thank you, Rachel. So, and this also applies to my son as well. And it's something that I've been doing my very best to work with him on, of figuring out these strategies. So could you expand a little bit more about that when you have the ADHD brain and you're not getting those internal cues? What's happening there and what are some of the strategies we can use?
Basically, just to back up for anyone who hasn't heard the term executive functioning skills, executive functioning skills are the skills that allow us to identify and follow through with responsible behavior. So it is things like inhibiting our impulses, impulse control. It's things like staying on task. It's things like organizing our time and our materials so that we can turn in our schoolwork on time. Kids with ADHD often have difficulty with executive functioning skills. You can have difficulty with executive functioning skills without having ADHD. And I will also say, just to reiterate for anyone who's interested in this portion, almost all children struggle with executive functioning skills. That doesn't mean they have ADHD. I just want to make that clear. So I used to work as a coach with a lot of kids who didn't have ADHD. But so what happens is the brain, these skills develop at different rates. And sometimes kids can't stay focused on a task. So the brain needs a certain amount of stimulation and engagement. This is very relevant for anyone who's doing virtual schooling. This will explain a lot. It needs a certain amount of stimulation and engagement. For kids with ADHD, that level may be higher. And what happens is if they don't get that stimulation and engagement, they will create it. So they're listening to a teacher online or even in person, and their brain isn't getting enough input, not because the teacher's bad, but because the brain just isn't getting enough input. So they will start talking to the kid next to them. Or they are on virtual school and they will go over to a YouTube tab because they're simply not getting enough they're not getting enough input. And another executive functioning skill is impulse control. And they don't have great impulse control. So they feel the impulse to go to the YouTube tab or to talk to their friend next to them because they're not getting enough input.
Mhm.
And they just blurt out something to their friend. They get in trouble for it. So what I used to do as a coach was say, let's isolate the areas where you have difficulty. If you forget to turn in your homework, all right, we need, like I said, some external cues. What cues will remind you? Is it your mom or dad? Which most of the time they would say no. I would say, okay, if it's not your mom or your dad, do you need to make a huge bright neon sign to remind yourself to put something in your bag? Do you need, to put a glass in front of you so that you notice that glass before you walk away, and that's a reminder to put your stuff into your backpack? So I actually rarely came up with the strategies when I was a coach. I would just help kids and teens say, where are you struggling? And what strategy do you want to try? This goes back to your scientist comment.
Yep.
We would do tons of experiments. Does this work? Does this work? And they would find the strategies to compensate for the fact that their brain did things a little bit differently. That's a long answer. I hope that wasn't too much.
No, well, at least not for me. I absolutely love this. And it's, on a personal note, I mean, I was checking off the boxes, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, right? That you were describing different things. And I'm like, yeah, I've seen that. I've seen that. I think it's such an important point that you make, that you can see these issues in children. It doesn't necessarily mean ADHD, but if you're thinking that is where they are going, if they've been diagnosed or you're about to get them diagnosed, or, it's been something that you've suspected, you can start to match up these behaviors and come at it with a bit more understanding. And I know for me, when I realized, I think this is going on with my son, and, I could see it in a variety of people that I know, and say, oh, well, if I understand this differently, that actually reduces my personal level of frustration. I'm not saying it goes to zero. And you know what? That seems to be the common point you're making today. None of it is supposed to go to zero here, but it helps you manage and even cope with what's going on, not just helping them cope, but you coping with, like, why does this keep happening? Understanding that there's a challenge with impulse control and that those external cues are huge. We have been taking the scientist route for quite some time, and we've tried. It took a while before he would take some of my suggestions. I'm like, your mom's a productivity coach. Can you just work with me? Okay, fine. What do you think will work? And I'd keep asking him, and he'd be like, I don't know. And I'm like, well, then let me give you some suggestions. Let's try some stuff.
And what that leads to is really important, because often I actually I don't work with kids and teens anymore. So I don't want anyone to hear this and reach out to me and say, can you work with my child? I don't do that anymore. I work with parents now. But what happens is I work with a lot of parents whose kids are resistant like that, and who say, I don't want to hear anything you have to say. And that is honestly, what that says to me is that child has some yuck going on. Remember, I use that term yuck. Often they are resistant because they don't want to feel stupid. They're sick of their parents telling what to do. They don't want to feel like anything's, they may be in denial. They don't want to think anything's wrong. It could be the tone we're using as a parent. So what I do with parents is to figure out, why is your child resistant to you? But yeah, they will be resistant. And until you actually work on that, they usually don't take those suggestions, and it's hard to be the detective with them.
That is such a good point. And that's exactly what I experienced. And so I just kept saying, okay, fine, that this is your choice. This is your responsibility, but you need to know your dad and I are here to help you, to assist you. We will have ideas. This is something so many people deal with. It is not you. You're obviously very bright. It is finding the right tools for you. Dude, it's what I coach for a living. And then finally he was like, okay, what do you got for me? But you're right. The conversation had to continue. We had to try different ways of having the conversation and really helping him understand that this does not reflect your abilities and your talents and the incredible person that you are. It's just a different way that your brain is wired. Are you seeing, I think, more of an understanding coming out now about that, like with terms like neurodiversity and stuff like that? Or what are you seeing?
I think of the people who are looking into this. Yeah. I mean, there's more understanding, there's more information out there, but I don't think people even know to look into this. They see the behavior as the behavior.
Yeah.
And, I'm in a field where I hear how people are dealing with behavior and it's like, well, let's punish it out of them if the consequence is bad enough. But what happens is parents come to me and I say, you've tried all the consequences, haven't you? So obviously it's not an issue that you don't have the right consequence. It's that they actually can't do what you're asking. And again, not an excuse. If they can't do it though, we need to teach them a strategy to compensate because, it's not something they can do. If you've taken away everything they care about and they're still not cleaning their room, it's not an issue with the consequence. It's an issue that you're not addressing the real problem. You're asking a blind child to see and then punishing them when they don't actually see, and it doesn't work well. And to your point earlier, then you get frustrated because you're like, I've tried all the consequences. They're still not changing. And then you approach them. One of the things I say to parents is, as humans, we are wired to detect within a millisecond when someone approaching us is an enemy or on our side. And often when we are frustrated because of our kids' behaviors, our energy exudes negativity. We are approaching our children as someone that's not on their side, and then they immediately shut down. And no matter what you say in that moment, they're not going to hear you because they're in their yuck place. They're in their fight or flight response, and they're not going to listen.
Yeah.
So to your point earlier, if we understand that they are not being a problem, they're having a problem, and then we approach them differently, and they're much more open.
I love that. Yeah. And to keep your own judgment, right?
Mm-hmm.
to the side. Listen, we're human. Okay. And we're probably very tired. Is this what parents go through? So taking that deep breath, setting your judgment to the side, getting curious about it on behalf of your child, helping them be curious, right? That's the path we need to take.
Exactly. It all starts with us being curious with ourselves so that we have the energy to give kids what they need. I mean, it really does start there.
Fantastic. We're getting to a good place to wrap up, but is there anything that you want to leave us with, something that I didn't ask or that you would really love us to take away today?
I think the biggest piece we have talked about, but I think the biggest piece is that when our kids are struggling, it's a sign that when their behavior is negative, when their moods are negative, when their attitudes are negative, it's a sign that they're struggling. Mm-hmm. And really we have to start with our struggle to help them with their struggle. And that's really what I do for a living right there is I reduce the struggles, increase the skills. When we can handle discomfort, when kids learn to handle discomfort, that's when everything changes. When they have these skills to be able to handle the fact that life is sometimes hard, everything changes.
And when we work on ourselves and then help guide them, not only are we solving the problem in the moment, we are helping them learn skills that will make a huge difference as they grow into adults.
That's exactly right.
I love that you start at the root of the problem. Yes, that is definitely why we bonded. This is exceptional. Thank you. Okay. Are you ready for a wrap up?
I sure am.
Awesome. Okay. I'd love for you to fill in the blanks for me. The song that always makes me dance is?
I couldn't come up with a song. It's when my kids are dancing. That's any song. When my kids are dancing, that's when I dance.
Do they have a favorite song or a song that's on repeat right now or one that just sort of comes up for them?
We put on Alexa, we put on just dance songs. That's what we do.
Dance songs. Okay. Yeah. All right. So here's what I want you to do. The next time I can't even say her name, so she doesn't, I call her Alejandra. That's my nickname for her. But the next time you put her on and a song comes on and your kids are dancing, you let me know what that song is. And
I'll write it down.
Right. And we will put that random song on the Positively Living Podcast Spotify dance playlist. I think we're on volume 2 right now. Okay. Next one. The quote or mantra I share all the time is?
Every day, the world will drag you by the hand yelling, this is important, and this is important, and this is important, and this, and this. And each day, it's up to you to yank your hand back, put it on your heart, and say, no. This is what's important.
Ian Thomas.
Yes, Ian Thomas.
It's so good. That was a great one. Okay. Now, how about a resource book or app that makes my life easier?
That would be the book, The Gift, because this is about women, written by a woman who was survived the Holocaust. And the reason I love this one is because for me, I hear gratitude practices all the time. I'm not a big gratitude person. I'm a big perspective person.
Mm-hmm.
So when I'm struggling, I don't actually go right to gratitude. I go right to perspective. And she really, this book in general, her life helps me truly put things in perspective, and it grounds me a lot.
Oh, that's beautiful. Perspective is such an effective tool to help us get into the state of gratitude.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's the tool I use all the time. Absolutely.
Love that. Speaking of gratitude, and last but not least, what or whom are you grateful for today, Rachel?
I'm grateful for your podcast. I will tell you that. And I'm also grateful for my kids who just have really forced me out of my comfort zone as a human being. I would never have been able to challenge myself as much if not for them.
I love that. And I agree. And I am grateful for you, and so grateful that we connected and we're able to have this conversation. And I truly hope it inspires everyone as much as it has me. So thank you for that. And why don't we talk a bit about where we can find you online and learn more? Your podcast, for one, which I have subscribed, and where else we can find you.
Yes, absolutely. So my podcast is called Your Parenting Long Game, and it does give both the tips for, discipline and big emotions and things, but also tips for us as parents to reduce our yuck. And then on Instagram, I'm Rachel Bailey Parenting. I do also have a Facebook group that goes with my podcast. So it's on Facebook, Your Long Game Podcast Community. And that's really where you find me hanging out, is either in that Facebook group, or I'm just now starting to be more on Instagram. I really have ignored it for a while, but everyone's told me I can't ignore it anymore. So I'll be in one of those two places hanging out.
Yeah. And if you go on Instagram, you find me, you'll find Rachel, because we'll be hanging out together there, having laughs and a good time, and really elevating life as moms, because we are all incredible.
Yes, we are incredible. We are.
Let's celebrate that. I'll be sure to have all of Rachel's links in the show notes. And thank you so much, Rachel, for shining your light in this world and for sharing it with us today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining me today. Your time is precious and limited, and I'm honored you chose to spend it with me. If you have feedback, questions, or want to schedule a chat, head to positivelyproductive.com/connect. And if you are looking for any of the resources referenced on the podcast, from books to products to training and more, go to positivelyproductive.com/resources.